Good day, everyone. Today I will be going over imaginary numbers. So I will be explaining what they are and just introducing them as a concept and the basics of how they are used in maths. So this is a concept that is only used, so if you're following the standard South African curriculum, it is only a concept you will encounter in AP Maths or in Admaths or in university maths. So it's not a very tricky concept, but it is a bit strange and it's not often super applicable to math. So let's start off by just introducing the concept. So as you have learnt more and more maths over time, you've been introduced to different types of numbers. So you started with your whole numbers, your natural numbers, 1, 2, 100, and so on. All of these numbers that are pretty straightforward. Then you were introduced to fractions and decimals. You were introduced to numbers like this, which are rational, which can be, so a rational number is a number that can be described as a simple fraction. Then you learnt about numbers which are irrational, numbers which can't be put into a nice fraction. So numbers like pi, which go 3.1415 and continue onwards, and just you can't put it as a nice simple fraction, you can't put it as a nice happy rounded number. So that's things like your pi. It's also things like surds, like the square root of 2, stuff like that. So as you've learned about these numbers, all of the numbers you've learned about so far, so whether it's those surds, whether it's normal numbers like that, like 100, whether it's whole numbers or fractions or anything you've learned so far, all of the numbers so far have been real. They've been real numbers. They are numbers which mathematically make sense, even if they're numbers like pi, which are really weird numbers. They exist. They are actually there. They're real. So now we're going to talk about numbers which are outside of that. Numbers over here. Now, this is a weird concept to wrap your head around, that there are numbers which aren't real, which we're still going to talk about and which we're still going to do maths with. It's a really weird thing to do, but that's what we're going to talk about. And these numbers are your imaginary numbers. And so the imaginary number we are going to deal with is the number I. And so I is the name we give to a certain number. So let's explain first before we actually go to what actually is I. So let's talk about square roots for a minute. So when you're dealing with a square root, you know a number like 2 can be under there, or 4. So if you've got the square root of 4, the answer to that is 2. So that's the same as saying 2 squared is equal to 4. Okay. Now, what about minus 2 squared? If you've got minus 2 squared, then what do you end up with? You end up with 4 as well, because the negatives cancel out. So, here's the question, and you can answer this for yourselves if you know. Is there any number that you could square in order to get minus 4? Is there anything squared that would give you negative 4? And I'm not talking about just a negative being on the outside here. That doesn't count. I'm talking about inside the brackets. Is there any number you could have which would give you, instead of positive 4, would give you negative 4? No, there isn't. There is no such number which would actually work like that. And so, here's the question. Is the square root of negative 4, does that make any sense? Because you're saying, what squared will give you negative 4? So, there is no answer to this. This is what you've learned so far in maths. There is no answer. There is no solution to that. But what if I told you that when you've heard there's no answer, what they actually meant, there is no real answer. Right. And so this is where maths gets a bit weird. This is where maths gets a bit silly, because it says, okay, fine, there's no real answer to this, but what if there was? What if we made an answer to this? And we did maths with that, even though it's not real, could we still get something useful out of it? And that's where imaginary maths was born. So, let's talk about the most simple version of this. So, the most simple one is this. This is the most basic elementary building block of imaginary maths, the square root of negative 1. So, you know the square root of 1 is 1, but the square root of negative 1, what is that? Now, we're going to name this I. This is what I is. I is just the square root of negative 1. And so, when we're dealing with, let's say we want to say, okay, we've got the square root of negative 4. When you've got the square root of negative 4, what do you have? You could say that it's the square root of negative 1 times 4. But remember, 4 is 2 squared. And so this 2 squared can be taken out, because all that's down here is multiplied together. So you can take out a 2, because the square root sign and the square cancel each other out. So that gets cancelled out with that, and that is why you can take it outside. So the square root of negative 4 is the same as saying 2 times the square root of negative 1, and that's the same as saying 2i. So any number can be broken down like this. Any imaginary number can be broken down into something multiplied by I. So if you had the square root of, let's say, 5, or rather, square root of negative 5, what would you do there? Well, 5 isn't a perfect square, but you could also say it is negative 1 times 5. And so you can break that up into square root of 5 times the square root of negative 1. And so that's the same as saying the square root of 5i. So any number which is the square root of a negative, you can get it in terms of I. And so in my following lessons, we'll talk about why this is useful and what happens if you square this, or what happens if you cube I. And we'll see what is the power of I to the power of 101. What is it? There are easy ways to figure all of this out, and we'll talk about graphing this as well. all of that in lessons to come. Okay, so I hope that was useful for you. I hope that established the concept of I, and I hope you're interested in seeing where this goes and how is I relevant to the real world. How can you actually do maths with I and get something that's actually useful out of this completely imaginary nonsense concept? Um, so if you've got any questions for me, or if you've got any requests for what I should cover next, then please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, then like it and subscribe it. I would really appreciate the support, and it would encourage me to continue with the series and other videos as well. If you want to contact me for private tutoring, then you can look in the description for a link to my website. But more than anything, thank you for being here, and remember, you're smarter than you think.